Good morning. Um, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues, and dear friends, good morning and welcome to session 5 of our high-level meeting. And it's our second day. And it's a pleasure to join you for this discussion on fostering resilient and sustainable graduation through smooth integration into global trade and innovation systems. In recent years, LDCs exports of goods and services have grown steadily. Yet, LDCs' share in global trade remains terribly small. It is about 1.7% of global trade. And our export structures are still highly concentrated and vulnerable to external shocks. At the same time, LDCs continue to grapple with widening trade deficits and limited diversification. These structural constraints leave many countries exposed at the very moment they approach their graduation milestone of their development journey. For decades, international support measures including duty-free, quota-free market access, special and differential treatment at WTO, flexibilities under TRIPS, and targeted technical assistance have been essential in supporting LDC's participation in global market. Of course, the global market is a fiercely competitive arena. And many graduating countries have built competitive competitive niche in some areas like garments, labor-intensive manufacturing, tourism, and emerging services by leveraging these preferences. However, graduation brings with it the risk of preference erosion, tariff escalation, and stringent rules of origin, and disruption of established export sectors. Even a modest increase in tariff in major markets could lead to significant contraction in LDC's exports, especially for LDCs which rely heavily on preference-dependent sectors. Moreover, the concentration of LDC exports in a small number of destination markets further heightens their vulnerability. Against this backdrop, our discussion in this session today is both timely and crucial. And resilient and smooth and irreversible graduation requires not only maintaining development gains, but also creating the conditions for countries to integrate more deeply and competitively into global and regional trading systems. And this includes preparing early for preference erosion, aligning trade components of smooth transition strategies with national development plans, and leveraging new opportunities in digital trade, services, green value chains, South-South cooperation, and regional integration initiatives. This session aims to highlight how trade remains a central engine of progress for least developed countries. And this session invites us to reflect on several core questions. How can graduating countries design forward-looking, trade-focused, smooth transition strategies that anticipate preference erosion and strengthen competitiveness? What policy reforms, institutional arrangements, and private sector support mechanisms have proven effective in maintaining and diversifying market access after graduation? And how can international support measures, including DFQF schemes, aid for trade, TRIPS-related flexibilities, and capacity building be recalibrated and extended to ensure predictable, and time-bound support. And importantly, how can regional integrations, South-South partnership, and impact-oriented investment drive the structural transformations needed to make graduation sustainable and irreversible? I encourage all our speakers and participants to be as concrete and action-oriented as possible. And our objective is to identify practical approaches through shared experience and practices that help graduating and graduated countries navigate trade-related vulnerabilities while laying the foundation for diversified, higher value, and more inclusive trade. And I look forward to having a rich and constructive discussions. We have today keynote speaker, the Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization, His Excellency Mr. Xiangqin Zhang, far left on my left, and the speakers panelist, His Excellency Professor Mohammadou Kaha, Ambassador of Permanent Representative of Gambia in Geneva, and coordinator of LDCs as WTO, with me. And I also have His Excellency Mr. Bunak Pok, Secretary of State, Ministry of Planning of Cambodia, on my right, and on my far right, Ms. Trudy Hasenberg, a CDP member and Executive Director of the Trade Law Center. I now invite our keynote speaker to take the floor. So His Excellency Mr. Xiangqin Zhang, you take the floor. Either you, or if you also prefer there, you can also go over there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. I just share this with my dear friend, Ambassador Khan, that Doha has a special significance for me. And 24 years ago, I was here in Doha when China joined the WTO. And what has seen the trade opportunity can bring for economic development. And 2 years ago, I was here in Doha when the world leaders met to build partnership for achieving the ambitions of Doha Program of Actions for LDCs, including those related to trade. And today, we are here in Doha to strengthen our partnership to help LDC achieve sustainable graduation and climb up the development ladder. LDCs are the most vulnerable members of international community, and they have a special place in the WTO. Over the years, WTO members have taken several steps to support LDC integration into global trade. They offered duty-free, quota-free market access. They ensured simple and transparent rules of origin. And they also took steps to help LDC services as our suppliers reach consumers in global market. In addition, LDC enjoy greater flexibility in implementing WTO rules. LDCs are also priority beneficiaries of WTO's technical assistance programs. At the same time, since 2018, AFT, the Aid for Trade, disbursement to LDCs have stagnated on average at around 14 billion US dollars per year. And in the context of a rapidly evolving environment, cooperation landscape, the Doha Program of Action ambition of doubling aid for trade to LDC by 2031 remains challenging to meet. WTO members recognize those evolving dynamics. They are currently examining how to keep the spotlight on this important work. Australia and Barbados, two WTO members, have put forward some ideas on this. And many of the LDCs who had grasped the trade opportunities stepped on the path to graduation. WTO members responded to the needs of graduating LDCs and took concrete steps to support LDCs on the path of graduation. First, they encouraged preference granting members to provide a transition period before withdrawing duty-free, quota-free market access. Today, a number of preference granting members, including the European Union, Japan, China, and the United Kingdom, offer a 3-year transition period to LDC graduates to continue accessing their markets duty-free. Second, at the 13th Ministerial Conference in Abu Dhabi, WTO members offered LDC graduates a 3-year transition period to implement WTO rules and to continue accessing WTO's technical assistance. And members are exploring what more can be done to support graduating LDC as we approach our 14th Ministerial Conference next March in Yaoundé in Cameroon. A lot has been achieved in the WTO to help LDC to reap the benefit of global trade. And well over the past 30 years, LDC's share in global trade has almost doubled from 0.59 in 1995 to 1.22% in 2024. It remains around 1%. LDCs still export a handful of products to a handful of markets, and the structural transformation of LDC economies is yet to see today. At the same time, the world is moving fast. New technologies are shifting trade patterns faster than ever before. It is high time for LDCs to explore new sources of growth and map out a forward-looking trade strategy. And this is why WTO and the UHOLS has been working hand in hand to help LDCs become more active players in global trade. Over the past couple of years, we consulted over 100 officials from LDCs on their trade priorities. We published 5 analytical notes to support policy makers in LDC identify emerging trade priorities. And this year, we spoke to LDCs in Asia Pacific and Africa on trade impacts of LDC graduation. I believe all those efforts are helping LDC delegations in Geneva and in capitals map out a forward-looking trade agenda which can help them identify their offensive trade interest, graduate from LDC category, and achieve the Doha Program of Action. So we have an important task ahead and a few milestones on the horizon. We have our ministerial conference in March 2026. Members are currently working hard to find a pathway on WTO reform. Development and LDC priorities are an important part of this work, and we have the 20th anniversaries of Aid for Trade initiative next fall. This can be an important moment to take stock of the progress made in supporting integration of developing countries and LDCs into the multilateral trading system and to pivot more towards partnership. I believe all these efforts will serve as a springboard for a successful midterm review of Doha Program of Action in March 2027. We remain committed to working with the international community to the LDCs, realize evolving trade opportunities, improving living standards, and reach new heights in economic development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, DTZ Zhang, for highlighting the various preferential treatments that are available under the WTO regime for its LDC member states. Rightly, you've mentioned the share of the global trade of LDCs has increased, but it is still terribly, terribly low. You've mentioned 1.2% of the global trade. And if we see the share of the LDCs population, it's 13% of the world population. So you can compare how much share the LDCs is getting from the world trading system. So there is a lot that we can do with partnership with the WTO and with our development partners. There's no other way than to enhance our productive capacity to compete in this fiercely competitive global market. I now turn to the panelists now. And first panelist we have in our session is His Excellency Professor Muhammadu Kao, permanent representative of the Gambia to UN and WTO in Geneva, and who is also coordinator of LDC group at WTO. Before giving him the floor, I have the question for him. The question is this: how can international support measures, including the FQFA schemes, aid for trade, capacity building on standards and trade negotiations, TRIPS-related assistance, and extended LDC-specific waivers be adopted or extended to provide predictable, time-bound, and needs-based support that safeguards development gains after graduation? And the second, in what ways can regional integration, South-South cooperation, and impact-oriented investment be leveraged to build resilient, diversified, and inclusive trade capacities, particularly in emerging areas such as services, digital trade, and green value chains, so that graduation contributes to long-term structural transformation and reduced vulnerability? So, Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and a very good morning, Your Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Before I get to the questions, let me begin by expressing my appreciation and gratitude to the OHR LLS leadership and team and the government of Qatar for their hospitality and for inviting me here today. It is indeed an honor to share some perspectives on the questions that have been asked by our chair, but particularly to the critical question on fostering resilient graduation. Before I get to the question, let me say that our goal, as we've had in the past 2 days, has been quite clear, which is to ensure that when an LDC graduates, it marks not an end of support, but the beginning of a new, sustainable chapter, a chapter of smooth integration into global trade, the safeguarding of hard-won development gains, and a genuine transformation beyond preferential regimes. We've also had, throughout the shared insights and perspectives at earlier sessions, and particularly from the insights shared by our keynote speaker, that graduation is indeed a milestone of hard-earned progress, but yet the abrupt loss of LDC-specific international support measures, from trade preferences to vital WTO flexibilities, poses to us a profound risk. Certainly it can disrupt our economies, it can reverse gains, and as the analysis that have been shared yesterday and today, this morning, even creates a dangerous path back towards LDC status. So the core principle we must champion together is to be pragmatic, or what I call pragmatic smooth transition that is anchored in the context of the realities of our changing multilateral trading landscape. And certainly, as we all agree, this is not about asking for privileges. It is indeed about common sense or rational and reasonable propositions that existing flexibility should be extended for an appropriate, reasonable period, which allows graduating countries to consolidate their progress, diversify their economy, enhance their productive capacities, and reasonably address emergent externalities and build through resilience. In the WTO, we have made incremental, very hard-fought progress. The landmark decision, if you remember, in Abu Dhabi at MC13 last year provides a crucial 3-year transition for certain benefits, like dispute settlement procedures, etc. This is a start, but certainly our work is far from complete. Key LDC specific special and differential treatment provisions in agreements like TRIPS, essential for technology transfer and industrial development, still lacks a clear transition pathway. We also note that the promise of paragraph 9 of UNGA Resolution 59/209, inviting WTO members to extend such treatment, must be made real. Now, to get to the question, Chair, I will submit about maybe 4 elements to the question on how can international support measures be adapted or extended for predictable needs-based support after graduation. I will say DFQF schemes. This is crucial. Preference granting countries, I submit, should extend the application of their preferential market access conditions with a clear, predictable phase-out schedule to allow for export sector adjustments. As we recall, on October 23, 2023, the LDC group reached a first milestone at the WTO in this area. And my DDG chair will remember that the adoption of the General Council decision, which encourages WTO members that remove countries from DFQF programs to provide a smooth and sustainable transition period. This was addressed in our GC meeting of October 2023. The second point to the question I submit is aid for trade and capacity building. Automatically extend eligibility for core LDC specific technical assistance and capacity building programs such as the EIF and other LDC specific training provided by the WTO for a fixed post-graduation period, and to pivot their focus towards compliance with non-preferential rules, SPS/TBT, digital trade, and negotiation skills for the new post-LDC reality. And I submit that in this area, WTO members did agree at Abu Dhabi at MC13 to provide a 3-year transition period after graduation to use the LDC specific procedures under the WTO dispute settlement, and 3 years to benefit from the WTO's technical assistance and training plan after graduation. Third, I submit TRIPS flexibilities and waivers. Secure a formal WTO decision to extend key LDC specific transition periods. For example, for TRIPS implementation under Article 66.1 for a defined term post-graduation, to strategically utilize these flexibilities for industrial policy and technology absorption. And fourth, extended waivers and SDT. We have to negotiate a comprehensive graduation package in the WTO that bundles and extends all the core LDC specific special and differential treatment provisions for an appropriate transition period, providing legal certainty and preventing an abrupt loss of policy space. This should include, I submit, colleagues, provisions that will allow us in the LDCs to maintain some key agriculture subsidies, for example, for transport and logistics subsidies, and flexibilities provided for developing countries, which, if I recall, a GNP per capita below $1,000 in 1990, constant US dollars as envisaged by Annex V11B for the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. So these are some thoughts, Excellency, that I wanted to share with you. But before I conclude, I will also remind that the promise of paragraph 9, as I mentioned earlier, of the UNGA Resolution 59/209 that invite WTO members to extend such treatment, we must negotiate and reach out with partners to make this real. While some of our partners, like the European Union, offer a grace period for preferential market access, a generalized and more predictable approach is needed. Resilience cannot be built on the shifting sands of goodwill alone. It requires predictable rules. Therefore, in my mind, as I yield back the floor, there are three questions that I will add to my answer, Chair, that requires our rational and reasonable reflection, that I submit that it must lead to realistic and pragmatic concrete answers anchored in realism and to anticipate the evolving state of play of a changing multilateral trading system. And one is, how can we secure a formal multilateral smooth transition mechanisms in the trade regime for all our graduating countries? We've been informed brilliantly by colleagues in their presentations on different aspects of that. The other thought as I answer this question is, how can we support our countries to adapt to evolving trading rules that were not anticipated and build competitive, diversified exports and build up our productive capacity before preferences phased out? Because once it's phased out, it's, for most countries, a sliding way backwards if we don't address those issues. And lastly, how can we ensure that technical assistance and funding, as I mentioned, like the EIF Phase 3 that is about to start, continue to bridge the capacity gap during this volatile period? In Geneva, our LDC group continues to negotiate with an objective for a streamlined proposal before the General Council meeting that is scheduled December 16. Our ambassadors are scheduled actually to meet to consider this streamlined draft for our submission this late afternoon. After this closed day, I will be joining the meeting with some of the ambassadors here to review that so that we can submit to the GC16. We continue to be constructive and to seek meaningful partnerships to resolve the remaining issues before MC14. In conclusion, I must say a resilient graduation is one where our country stands firm, not falls back. It is where integration into global trade is seamless and development is irreversible. So colleagues, those are my thoughts on the first question that you've answered, Your Excellency. I didn't get to the second question. I will wait till we go through the two tables and I can answer the second question. If you want me to take it quickly, I can do that. Excellencies, the second question that was asked is how can international support measures be adapted or extended for predictable needs-based support after graduation? That was the question I answered. The second one has to do with the South-South cooperation. How can regional integration, South-South cooperation and investment be leveraged to build resilient, diversified trade capacities? Our experiences so far suggest that most of our members in the LDC tend to meet the graduation criteria before having really expanding their productive capacity or diversify their economy and achieve significant structural transformation to ensure resilience in the face of external shocks like climate change. So regional integration, we can use regional trade agreements and supply chain pacts as anchor points for graduated countries, helping them to diversify exports within regional value chains. For example, in agro-processing, light manufacturing, and harmonizing standards to reduce dependency on extra-regional preferences. Second, South-South cooperation. We must foster peer learning platforms and targeted partnerships between graduated and graduating LDCs to share best practices on structural transformation and develop cooperative projects in services, digital infrastructure, and green technology transfer, and being mindful of the uniqueness of each of our countries, that it is not one glove fits all. We cannot just copy and paste. Third, impact-oriented investment. We have to deploy the risking instruments, and we've had yesterday a wonderful insights from our colleague from Ethiopia on some very innovative financing that include blend finances, guarantees, and domestic revenue pool to support diversification through development banks, to channel investment into high potential non-traditional sectors like sustainable tourism, digitally enabled services, and renewable energy components, manufacturing, directly building productive capacity beyond commodities. We have to go beyond commodities to be resilient. And lastly, we have to focus on emerging areas. And these are, we have to design dedicated gateway initiatives within the South-South and regional frameworks to build competencies in digital trade regulations, as we've had submitted by our colleague from the Technology Bank, facilitates cross-border data flows that was also mentioned earlier this morning, and integrate into green and circular economy value chains where we can position our graduating countries for the future global economy to make sure that we don't slide back. And I yield back the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Kaha, for your presentations, and thank you for coordinating the LDC issues within WTO with your strong leadership, and we expect that LDCs will be treated in a fair manner within the WTO system. And you mentioned there is a danger of abrupt loss of trade preferences and WTO's flexibilities, which might threaten the smooth course of our graduation. So this is a serious concern that we've been raising, and that is why we are looking for an extended period of preferential treatment. And in most of the cases, we've seen that the 3 years of extension, but our ask was a longer term extension. And we still wanted to see the understanding of the WTO members and international community that the LDCs require a little bit extended period of preferential treatment so that their graduation will be smooth, irreversible, and sustainable. Now I move to our next panelist. We have His Excellency Bunak Phok, Secretary of State for Planning from Cambodia. Excellency, you have the floor. And I have the question before handing over you to the floor. The question is, how can graduating countries design trade-focused elements of their smooth transition strategies, covering goods, services, intellectual property to anticipate preference erosion, strengthen export competitiveness, and ensure sustainable and irreversible graduation in global and regional markets? And in what ways can regional integration and South-South cooperation and impact-oriented investment leverage to build resilient, diversified, and inclusive trade capacities? So you have the floor, Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to address the two questions as raised by Mr. Chair. These two questions point to the role of STS that we are preparing, because STS will become a practical tool for us in addressing the challenges, vulnerability, and also impacts due to gradation. And addressing these impacts and vulnerability not only during the gradation, but post-gradation as well. Grounded in the principle of national ownership, STS must be nationally owned, fully aligned with national development plans, budget frameworks, and sustainable development goals. So I would like to share the point relating to these three parts of the approach we are using to develop our STS. First, alignment of with the National Development Plan. The STS is envisioned as a standalone government strategy explicitly designed to advance the goal of Cambodia's national development agenda. Its priority will be aligned fully with the Pentagonal Strategy Phase 1, the National Strategic Development Plans, and several sectoral development policy frameworks, such as industrial development policy, trade policy. We focus on building export competitiveness, strengthen domestic revenue mobilization, and enhance climate resilience. In this way, the STS will serve as an operational plan with action-oriented measures to address post-graduation challenges within these national priorities. Second, integration into national budget frameworks. Sustainability depends on financing the transition through domestic system. The STS must be fully costed and incorporated into the national medium-term expenditure framework. This ensures that line ministries allocate dedicated budget lines for STS activities, providing predictable funding beyond political cycles and donors' projects. Such integration transformed the STS from a conceptual framework into a fiscally actionable strategy. The third one is related to SDG framework. The SDGs offer a robust tool for monitoring and alignment by mapping STS milestones directly to relevant STS targets. Cambodia can ensure that its transition contributes to globally recognized development objectives while maintaining access to alliance financing and partnership. In Conclusion, coherence will be achieved by making the SDS a core function and priority of government, nationally owned and driven, financed through the national budget and measures against progress on the SDS. These points are the answers to the question 1. For the question 2, still related to SDS, because as you know, when we have the national development plans, we still highlight some key priority related to the national development plans and match them with the areas that we want to address during our graduation. Several points I wish just to highlight here related to the role of the regional integration, social cooperation, and impact-oriented investment. First, a coordination framework is needed that align bilateral, multilateral, and private sector partners with the national priorities. By doing that, we reduce the fragmentation of policies and action plans. Another point is about enabling resource mobilization by identifying post-graduation needs, which reassures partners and encourage concessional finance, blended instruments, and private investment. The third one is about integrated technology transfer and innovation ecosystems into transition plannings, attracting partnership that supporting digital transformation and value chains upgrading. Another point is institutionalized dialogue platform and transparent monitoring. These are essential to keep partners' engagement and trust after LDC graduation. The fifth point is about preserving concessional and blended finance windows. It's critical to bridging gaps, especially in MSME, competitiveness, infrastructure, and social sector investment. The last but not least is the framing transitional strategies around long-term resilience and competitiveness, including climate adaptation, economic diversification, and regional integration, ensures continued support and align with sustainable development goals. Before I close, I would like to mention that Cambodia STS will focus on 7 priorities. One is economic diversification, second is trade and investment, the third is social development, fourth is climate resilient and sustainable development, the fifth is financing and resource allocations, the sixth is institutional capacity and governance, and the last one is cooperation and partnership. Therefore, support from development and trading partners should be aligned with Cambodia's identified needs and priorities. Also, another point I would like to highlight is that to mitigate this impact on trade, we now have Ministry of Commerce, which is well ahead of the plan in doing the trade negotiation with relevant partners and other new partners. Their focus not only just the existing one for the extension or for the prolong of the extension, but also on bilateral trade agreement. They are very active in doing that to make sure that when we graduate, we still have things in hand to move on with. In some, sustainable partnership require embedding resilient transition, transparencies, and financing innovation at the heart of the transition strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary of State for Planning Cambodia, for your presentation. We all agree that we need to ensure sustainable and irreversible graduation. And in this direction, we are moving forward with sustainable transition strategy. And rightly you've mentioned this must be a nationally owned process which would be funded by a national budgetary framework and also coordinated with the SDG achievement planning, and this must be coherent and coordinated. If we recall from the earlier discussions that it could also be done after the mapping out of a productive capacities of a graduating country, so that that SDS will be more pragmatic and concentrated to the particular sector where the productive capacities has to be enhanced in due course of graduation. Thank you, Excellency, once again. And I now turn to our last but not the least panelist, Ms. Trudy Hasenberg, and she is Executive Director of Trade Law Center, and she is also a CDB member. I also have one question for her. What trade policy reforms, institutional arrangements, and private sector support measures have proven most effective in helping graduate and graduated LDCs maintain and diversify market access, for example, through new or upgraded trade arrangements, preference arrangements, rules of origin adjustment, or trade facilitation initiatives? So you have the floor, Madam.
Thank you very much, Chair, for the question, and good afternoon, colleagues. I would like to thank OHR LLS and the Qatar Fund for Development for bringing this conversation to the recently graduated, but also those LDCs in the pipeline for graduation. But as one of my colleagues on the panel indicated, structural transformation and productive capacity development and diversification needs to begin long before graduation comes onto the LDC agenda. And therefore, I would like to suggest that this kind of conversation be brought to the LDC community more generally. I'll start, Chair, with some comments about trade policy reforms, policy making, institutional arrangements, and the engagement of the private sector in policy processes. While we're focusing here on trade policy connects very importantly to many other important policies that LDCs are including in their smooth transition strategies as they prepare for graduation. Very important connection on which I will focus in a minute is, of course, trade and industrial policy. But just to say a few words about institutional arrangements and policy-making processes at the national level. It is extremely important that we support intra-governmental connections across ministries and government agencies, including sector regulators and other agencies when we are making policy. Trade policy in a sense, provides us an opportunity to take a look at new approaches to industrial policy, sector-based policy, and a range of other important support areas as far as the private sector is concerned. But it is absolutely critical that the private sector be at the table. We spoke about evidence-based policy, and this is, of course, absolutely critical. Where do we get the evidence? And we do, of course, collect data, whether it be at border posts and through other initiatives. But in my view, the input and the contribution of qualitative data that we get from engaging with the private sector, and this should be across the board, from our large companies, which are very often multinationals that have established commercial presence in our territories, to the small and medium enterprises, and also the informal cross-border traders, which on the African continent are mostly women. In some of our LDCs, we have national trade policy committees. In some cases, the private sector, through their various bodies, sector associations, industry associations, are represented. But that is not always the case. I think it is extremely important that we take a look at what is necessary to make policy for those who will be investing, producing, trading, and innovating in our economies. And that is the non-state actor community. Turning now to other aspects of your question, Chair, we focus here on trade policy, and 2025 has seen significant shocks to trade policy, to international trade, and indeed to international trade governance as we've come to know it in the post-Second World War era, and in particular since the establishment of the World Trade Organization. Indeed, we know that the US trade policy ignores WTO rules and embarks on a unilateral policy focused on the use of the import tariff to address, as we know, a very specific focus on trade deficit, but also to re-industrialize the American economy. I think we all know here that the import tariff on its own cannot provide for the industrialization, the productive capacity development, the structural transformation that is indeed the focus of our conversation here. I think extremely important to keep in mind when we take a look at the trade industrial policy connections, there are new approaches, as my friend and colleague Tess reminded us this morning, that are absolutely necessary. We need to rethink what will attract the kind of quality investment that we need to support our industrialization and productive capacity development consonant with our development objectives. We need to know where the barriers are to cross-border trade. And this brings me to an issue, Chair, that you've mentioned, trade facilitation. Trade facilitation, extremely important in the overall context, not only of trade, but facilitating cross-border trade actually means cross-border facilitation of economic linkages. In other words, trade facilitation is a component of industrial policy, both at national level, but also, for example, in a regional context, as we find on the African continent, where we hope to, through cross-border value chains, transform the economies and the economic structures of the member states of the African Union. But trade facilitation, as we define it in our Aid for Trade agenda, is not enough anymore. The role of services, transport, communication, financial services, are all facilitators, not only of trade, but also of value chain development. And yes, Deodat tech matters too. Digital transformation, digitization of border processes, of data collection, management, and analysis are also part of a broader scope of trade facilitation as industrialization. Trade facilitation also improves transparency, predictability, and legal certainty, contributing to a more competitive and effective business environment for attracting the kind of foreign direct investment that we need, but also leveraging domestic investment. And we should not forget about small-scale investors. Colleagues, a small-scale enterprise that opens up a new business across the border is as much an investor as a large multinational that comes to establish a business in our country. I'd like to say just a couple of things about regional trade agreements, Chair, that you asked me to have a look at. And here I'd like to focus on unilateral preference arrangements as well. So really look at preferential trade that is WTO consistent. So RTAs that are consistent with WTO rules and the unilateral preferences that exist under waivers in the World Trade Organization. I think these have become increasingly important, and we're currently seeing, certainly on the African continent, a flurry to conclude new trade agreements with global partners. Indeed, some of the large players in the global trade context are knocking on the doors of African countries, in some cases coming with a framework agreement, which we are requested to consider and sign, paving the way for free trade agreement negotiations. I think extremely important to keep in mind that in this context of negotiating new agreements, there are important developments, and they also have implications for global industrial restructuring. In fact, the shocks to the global trading system have set in motion a very much faster process. It's not new, but a much faster process of regionalization, of reshoring value chains. Because a consideration now, in this context of the relationship between trade and industrial policy, but also in negotiating new trade agreements, is national security. In this context, we see that geopolitics becomes a driver for new trade partnerships and new trade agreements. Trust is a very important consideration, both in terms of shaping the agenda that we will negotiate with new partners, but also how we will implement that. The unilateral arrangements, and I think these are extremely important, and as we've heard from Deputy Director General Zhang, there have been important decisions recently in the WTO to extend the life of those preferences for graduating and graduated LDCs. But, colleagues, that does not change the rules. And some of the very important components of those regimes may well not allow us to develop our productive capacity development path, our structural transformation, as we deem appropriate. And I'm talking here specifically about rules of origin, Chair, which you've asked me to say something about. Rules of origin are very necessary in preferential trade arrangements to protect the integrity of the preferences. However, they also can lock us into a particular pathway for industrialization and particular value chain connections. We keep in mind that it is not only the actual design of the rules of origin, but also the administrative arrangements which are necessary to be complied with that are important here. Notably, rules of origin differ from one agreement to another. And I think for all of us, the recent case of Lesotho, least developed country, landlocked, which had become a major beneficiary of such a unilateral arrangement, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, has not been, over a period of 25 years, been able to diversify its markets. It remained locked in to a particular trade relationship, which abruptly was interrupted this year through tariff announcements and the expiry of the arrangement. There are risks associated with such dependency. Very important to keep in mind that not all unilateral arrangements are of the same kind. But I think we do need to keep in mind that there are ways of tailoring rules of origin arrangements, for example, through cumulation, which permits us to source inputs from non-partners to a particular trading arrangement and still qualify for that preferential market access, are really, really important. But I want to use just very briefly the example of Lesotho. The rules of origin for clothing and textiles, the so-called garment provisions in AGOA, were particularly generous. Least developed countries like Lesotho could source inputs from anywhere in the world, opening opportunities to pursue efficiency and competitiveness in those sourcing strategies. Other agreements also allow accumulation. And if we look at accumulation, for example, in the garment sector on the African continent, we do have quite a robust cotton value chain. But if a garment manufacturer is looking at synthetic fabric or new generation fabrics, there are supply-side constraints. So accumulation with other countries on the African continent does not help. So these realities have to be taken into account very, very carefully. It is also time, I think, colleagues, that we think about the rules of origin methodologies, some of which we've been using for more than 50 years now. Production realities are very, very different from what they were in the 1970s. And here, tech, AI tools can be extremely useful in terms of tracking value chain, sourcing patterns, and so on, so that the integrity of a system can be maintained. In my last minute, I want to mention just very briefly two issues. Another very important connection that some colleagues have mentioned yesterday, and that is climate. And many of our LDCs are facing significant challenges from climate shocks. And I think about Sao Tome Principe, the floods of 2021, for example. Colleagues, it takes years to recover from that. But this year at COP30, there was a very important focus on trade-climate linkages. And this came perhaps a little bit unexpectedly, but it is so important because many of our recently graduated LDCs battle with our third indicator for graduation, the EVI, economic and environmental vulnerability. So we have to look at the environmental vulnerability alongside the other economic considerations. So what happened at COP30? It marked a historic turning point in the way climate governance engages with international trade, I think. Although global attention during the COP was, of course, focusing on core issues such as climate finance, phase out of fossil fuels, which we could not agree to, unfortunately, but trade-climate linkages became one of the most contested topics at this summit. And I think this was particularly concerned with unilateral climate measures that have a trade impact. And a good example, of course, is the EU range of measures under the EU Green Deal, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, Forestry Directive, Farm to Fork Strategy, and many, many others. This is something that we must take into account as we promote green industrialization for our LDCs as well. My final point, and this brings me back to Africa, and innovation, Chair, that you've asked about in trade agreements. We've heard some references to the African Continental Free Trade Area. And yes, there are important delays and there are blockages, and we're not making progress as we had hoped. But there are interesting innovations in that agreement, and I would like to mention very briefly the Protocol on Women and Youth in Trade. This was not in the initial design. It came later, and it was driven by the demand not only of some of the member states, but very importantly by women and youth organizations. And so this instrument highlights the systemic challenges that women and youth face in trade and related areas such as industrialization. And there are no surprises. We know what they are: access to finance, border harassment, and a number of other issues. The instrument provides an innovative way of thinking about these issues, but the solutions are not provided. They will be in the trade and services agenda, where financial services is a key focus, but also in complementary issues such as the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System. But this protocol also specifically mentions intellectual property rights. And women are very often not part of the innovation systems. And even if they do, for example, in agriculture, develop innovations related to irrigation, many of those innovations never reach a point of commercialization or may be co-opted by other agents. Women-led enterprises and youth-led enterprises also face specific challenges related to meeting the new generation barriers of standards, sanitary, phytosanitary, technical regulations, and so on. And the state parties have agreed to provide particular support to women and youth enterprises to meet the new generation barriers, not tariffs, but the new generation barriers that they will face as they explore trade opportunities beyond their borders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Hazenberg, for your presentation. And structural transformations of LDCs requires right kind of trade policy. And this trade policy is, of course, kind of a multi-sectoral task, and which is also connected with several other policies, as you mentioned, particularly with the industrial policy. And we all need qualitative data to make an evidence-based policy, in which we LDCs are lagging behind collecting a qualitative data on our various sectors of our economy. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, we've heard our keynote speakers and all the panelists. LDCs are on the margin of global economic development, and LDCs are on the margin of the global trading system. And that is why we are calling for our development partners and international systems to provide us a meaningful support and meaningful provisions so that the LDCs would be enabled themselves to come to the mainstream of global economic development and global trading system. And we've seen that regional integrations helps bring intra-regional trade, and consequently, the intensity of regional integrations also brings regional prosperity. but it is, most of the cases, very slow. And we LDCs believed in globalizations and believed in rules-based international trading regimes. But we've also seen equally a very powerful force which is going opposite. There is a regressive trend on globalization and as well as rules-based trading system. And we are really concerned about that trend. And we strongly stand for a rules-based international trading system. And we are calling for our partners to provide us the extended period of preferential treatment during which we'll be enable ourselves to compete in the fiercely competitive global market and make our graduation smooth and irreversible, sustainable. I now open the floor and request the distinguished delegates to take the floor and express your thoughts and views on our discussions, on our issues of discussions. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, really enlightening presentation. Much appreciate it. Again, my name's Daniel Gay, independent consultant, currently working with the UK government on the Evidence and Innovation Programme of the Centre for Expertise on Trade. I'd particularly like to ask Trudy, but I'd also be interested in the views of the other panelists about this issue of the extension of preferences following graduation and whether this could be regularized, if there are lessons to be learnt from other examples, and whether maybe the uncertainty could be reduced by standardizing the extension of preferences to preference granting markets and regions after graduation. So it's a sort of whether there could be a greater removal of the uncertainty after graduation by a kind of more standardized mechanism for continuing duty-free, quota-free market access after graduation. So it didn't have to be renegotiated. Because the reason I say this is because the UK developing countries trading scheme, when you stop being an LDC, you move from what are called comprehensive preferences, which are for all LDCs, to enhanced preferences, which essentially grant the same duty-free, quota-free market access to UK markets. Also, the UK provides regional cumulation, and it will further relax rules of origin for countries in Asia, so that, for example, Bangladesh will no longer have to abide by the double transformation rule for its garment exports to the UK. And essentially any input from a regional exporter to the UK can be considered as originating from that country. Yeah, so it's about whether this kind of scheme could be an example for others and whether it's useful to kind of go down that avenue. Thank you.
Maldives, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the panel for the insights. Something that kept coming to my mind in the earlier session and this session is the issue of state capacity. If we are talking about enhancing productive capacity of a country, or if we're talking about getting access to greater access to trade regimes, one of the issues that LDCs and developing countries face, including SIDS, is this lack of state capacity to actually be engaged and be productive. If you're talking about WTO negotiations, oftentimes smaller countries or even LDCs were not present in the room when negotiations are taking place, and we're not able to contribute because we don't have the capacity to do so. So how do we tie these concepts of enhancing productive capacity, structural transformation, and also getting access to trade regimes with the concept of state capacity? And how do we step back from these highly technical negotiations on trade regimes to enhance the capacity of these countries? Because we think that improving and investing in state capacity is essential to ensure that there's sustainable graduation, sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Go ahead. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for all the intervention and keynote presentation as well. Actually, my question is directed to Rudy, which is really an excellent intervention. And you mentioned trade facilitation as a form of industrial policy, which I agree. But in the context of LDCs, do you see it within the framework of the Bali Agreement, or something that goes beyond that? Number one. Number two, the rules of origin you mentioned is interesting, for LDCs. But I presume, as you highlighted, the easier the rules, single transformation type, where they can import raw materials from anywhere, and just simply to process export is the better. But if they want to add value, and if they want, especially at regional level, through regional value chains, then double transformation using cumulation will be better, for example, for African LDCs. So how does one reconcile this wish to import from anywhere, like China or Asia, for example, raw material, and do very little value addition in export, and rules of origin that forces countries to accumulate? And that way, at regional level, at least they add value, which is a form of industrial policy. Thank you.
Bangladesh, please. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just like to emphasize the point that Dr. Gay has raised, and tying it up with the colleague from Maldives. Yesterday I mentioned, when you are less developed countries, you have your capacity is also least. Okay, so least developed countries. So if we could formalize that transition facilities, as UK has done, then in that case, this country by country, case by case negotiation can be avoided. I can see in the draft outcome document also is mentioned case by case, and that makes it difficult for many of the LDCs, because negotiating on a case-by-case basis on a complex matter, that capacity is also limited. I think we should aim at having some kind of a generalized facilities, as UK can be an example. Thank you.
Thank you, Bangladesh. Any other delegations wishes to take the floor? I don't see the case. So I'll turn back to our panelist and keynote speaker. I'll start from keynote speaker. Just your brief comments, if you have. Please, DTZ. Yes, DTZ Zan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for those questions and comments. I would like to combine the first question and the last question about the extension of the preference treatment for graduating LDC, because they are related to each other. And now the agreement achieved by the WTO members is not a legal binding obligation for members who provide preference treatment to the LDC to extend those treatments. And it's also not the case that you need to negotiate one by one. This is something we also want to avoid. So it is in the middle ground. It's an encouragement from the WTO point of view, the membership point of view, for those countries who provide the preference treatment to the LDCs to continue to extend those treatments. So it's not a perfect outcome for the LDC graduating LDC, but it's not the worst scenario that only individual countries negotiate with those LDCs. So this is my first comment. On the second question, the capacity constraint, I do assume that the capacity constraint is the main constraint of the LDC and developing countries in the integration of the global economy. And two things are important to address this issue. One is capacity building and technical assistance program. According to our biannual technical assistance program, we would like to provide a more tailor-made program for the LDC. And it's not enough. We need to have more partnership, including the partnership from the private sector. For example, many LDCs want to embrace digital trade. We can provide some technical assistance, but we have limited knowledge. We need to involve the private sector to work together with us to help the LDCs. That's the reason why we have the Digital Trade for Africa program. We select 10 pilot countries in Africa and work together with those private sectors to help those countries to review the situation to improve the regular framework, which is related to the ecosystem for digital trade. And I also want to comment on that. Capacity building is important. At the same time, we also encourage those LDCs, graduate LDCs, not only focus on their defensive interests in the multilateral trading system, in the global economy. Special and different treatment is important. It's an integral part of the WTO, and it's a legitimate right for the LDC, graduating LDC. But, sometimes, this is my observation, the LDCs, graduating LDCs, and other developing countries just neglect the offensive interests for them, which are also important, and is strategically important. What is the opportunity of the emerging issues, like digital trade I just mentioned, green economy? So that's the reason why we also want to take this opportunity to encourage the developing countries, LDCs, especially the graduating and graduated LDCs, to look at the landscape. What's the offensive interest? What's the defensive? And try to strike a balance in the negotiations of a multilateral trading system. On the third question about the TFA, Trade Facilitation Agreement, is the important achievement we had in the past 2 decades. But if we look at the implementation rate, we know what's the gap there. For developed countries, the implementation rate of this agreement is about 100%. But for developing countries, the average is 70%. And for LDC, 30%. The agreement is good, but the implementation rate is low, especially for LDC. So this is a huge gap to catch up. I just mentioned the biannual technical assistance plan, and according to our survey, among members, including LDCs, TFA implementation is the #1 priority for developing country LDCs. So on one hand, we need to have the eye on the emerging issue, the new issue. At the same time, we need to focus on the implementation of the existing WTO agreement, which the graduating LDC can benefit from. Thank you.
Thank you, DDG, for your final comments. Now I come to the Ambassador Kaha. Ambassador, if you have final thoughts, please take the floor. Brief remarks.
Yeah, thank you so much. I completely agree with my colleague, His Excellency Ambassador Jeng. First, on the extension of preference, following the question that was asked, I am of the view that LDCs require greater predictability and consistency. Today, we rely heavily on bilateral case-by-case extension, and as was said, I don't think that is helpful or that is the way we should go. Our collective approach is important because case-by-case extensions, as the Excellency mentioned, will create some uncertainty for government, for exporters, for investors, for everybody. So to secure a truly smooth transition, it is my view also that we need to simplify, we need to harmonize, and we have to develop friendly rules of origin, including extended or diagonal cumulation arrangements, as it was mentioned. This would allow the LDCs to integrate fully into regional and global value chains and maintain competitiveness during the transition period and beyond. Simplifying documentation and realistic value addition thresholds are indispensable to allow compliance cost to small and vulnerable farms. On the LDC state capacity, it is my view also that sustainable graduation cannot be achieved if our countries must continuously negotiate transitional measures one by one. A case-by-case approach is quite resource-intensive and reinforces what I would say structural inequalities in bargaining power. What we need is a shift towards a generalized capabilities and collective solutions. It's a win-win for us to do that, strengthening our national institutions, improving trade intelligence systems using data, and using the new emerging AI-enabled tools, enhancing standards and quality infrastructure, and building negotiation capacity will certainly empower our LDCs to benefit from global trade rules and not be constrained by them. At the same time, I will say also generalized frameworks for smooth transitions coupled with targeted technical assistance and aid for trade would certainly allow both graduating and graduating LDCs to plan with confidence. So the essence of smooth and sustainable graduation is not only phasing out of LDC specific measures, but certainly the building of resilient and competitive economies. So through predictable preference, extensions, flexible rules of origins, and strengthening, as you mentioned, state capacities can assure a future where our members can graduate not into vulnerabilities, but into opportunities and transformation. I submit.
Thank you, Ambassador. I now turn to the Secretary of State of Cambodia for her brief remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with the previous speakers on the issue raised by the audience. I just want to emphasize one point related to trade capacity. We cannot just focus on improving the state capacity in trade negotiation or anything along that line alone without looking at the products that we have. As LDC, we take advantage of the preferential support measures set by the international organizations. And by taking that advantage, we sort of not much care about what we should do in the future to move up the ladder of the trade. But now it's time that we have to look into that, because we're going to lose all the preferential support. When we start looking at this kind of thing, we start to see many things in front of us are not ready. Losing preferential trade agreements, okay, we strengthen the capacity of the institutions taking care of that, like Ministry of Commerce. Yeah. Right now, the trade policy for Cambodia 2025-2034 will come very soon, I think by the first or the second month of 2026. In this new trade policy, we will see one big section devoted to LDC graduation. What is exactly explicitly stated in that, I don't know yet. All I know just bullet points in that section. So I cannot elaborate any further on that, but it's coming soon. On the other side of the story, looking at the production, especially cost of production, is high. So if the production is high, if we need to meet the requirement, new standard after we graduate, what can we do to lower the cost of production so that we can compete international market? So many things we have to do. Starting from improving the productivity of labor force, infrastructure, support mechanism, logistics, so on and so forth, all are things in the same buckets that we have to take care. Okay. With that, I thanks for your questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Excellency, for your final thoughts. I now give the floor to Madam Hasenberg. Just 2 minutes, please. We're exceeding our allocated time. Please, just brief.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just 2 quick responses. I think starting off with the trade facilitation agenda, I think it is true that we have been focusing very much on trade in goods. In other words, agriculture and manufacturers, and facilitating cross-border trade. However, the nature of our economies, the structures are changing so dramatically, and that applies to LDCs across the board as well. So focusing on trade facilitation as it pertains to services, but also digital, becomes absolutely imperative. In the case of services, for example, of course, we have different modes of supply. So mode 3, facilitation, relates to the investment facilitation agenda. And we have a plurilateral initiative and in the WTO investment facilitation for development, which is really important. But the tricky one, which is often very contentious, is cross-border movement of persons, whether it be users of services, tourists or students or individuals who come for medical treatment and so on, but also services providers. And I think we really need to take a look at how we can facilitate that in a rules-based manner. When it comes to digital trade, and I think this is really at the frontiers now of trade facilitation, technology-enabled services delivery, digital product services, and so on, very important. This brings in a whole new range of governance imperatives: cybersecurity, data protection, consumer protection, access to information, ownership of data, data storage, and all of those kind of issues. So I think these are the frontiers of the new trade facilitation agenda that we really, really should be looking at very importantly. Finally, as far as rules of origin are concerned, I think, Dan, what we do have to keep in mind is that if we have different rules of origin with different preferential or regional trade agreements, think about a small enterprise that wants to diversify its markets away from its initial starting point, if you like. So if Lesotho wants to export to the UK or the EU or somewhere else, it has to comply with different rules of origin. And this militates against SME involvement in trade. And I think this is a major consideration. Tess, your question is a much more difficult one. We want to support value addition and beneficiation within our LDCs, and I think this is extremely important. My experience, though, if we look at the double transformation rule, we've tried this in the Southern African development community for pretty much more than 20 years. It has not solved the supply constraints of having sufficient supply capacity of yarn and fabric to meet the demands of the garment industry. So something is missing. And I think it's a complex issue, but we really need to look perhaps at different kinds of rules of origin, specific production processes that may qualify for origin status, for example. We see that in agreements that, for example, New Zealand has concluded with pharmaceutical production, some really innovative thinking about what process will qualify to have a product of New Zealand origin, for example. So I think this is really, really important, where our universities and others really need to help us to do the research. But also we need to hear from the private sector what will work, what will encourage you to add value at home, and how can we support that through a rules-based governance regime, including rules of origin. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, everyone. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I do not dare to provide you a synthesis, but I just want to close our conversations. But let me say a few words before closing this session. LDCs have no decisive strength within international or multilateral system, let alone the capacity of individual country, as Maldivian delegates raised the issue, the state capacity to negotiate within the labyrinth of international systems. That's why we usually negotiate as a bloc to convince our development partners. And we use our persuasive power with logic, reason, friendship, and goodwill to garner meaningful support from our development partners and other stakeholders. And we are not advocating anything else other than calling for a just, inclusive, representative, and democratic global governance where we can also participate with dignity. And we want to march ahead in our economic development and prosperity. And our development trajectory is skewed toward more developed country. And inequality within the country and among the country is increasing every day. And the embarrassing fact we all know is the richer is getting richer, and the poor people are languishing in the poverty and destitution with hardship, more hardship. And if we work together, I think the prosperity is enough for all. And we can educate everyone. We can feed everyone. And we can cure everyone if we work together. And let us work together for prosperity of all. And let us not leave anyone, any country, behind this humanity's march towards modernity, towards prosperity. And that is what I think we can do. And as LDCs, we are always ready to work and to gear up our own development processes and with meaningful partnership. And as we titled our meeting, with an ambitious partnership with our development partners. With this, I'd like to thank once again our keynote speaker, our distinguished panelists, and all the distinguished participants for your constructive participations. And I declare the session is over. Thank you.